Hello and welcome to a redo of episode number 44 of Remy's Rave of the Day. It was told to me that we were having some audio issue. The audio was terrible, it was bad, and so we're coming back on here and we're gonna do it all over again. And so hopefully the audio is working okay. Hopefully it's going well. If not, I'll be notified again, and then we'll have to maybe do it another time or figure out what exactly is going on. But here's what we're raving about today. We're not really raving about a word. We're not raving about a phrase. We're raving about a special message, a message that was given to the young people of the Meadows Church of Christ, again, located right here in Beaumont in the great state of Texas. And the special message comes from Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1, there is a cool, thought-provoking, exciting message that Paul is writing in Galatians chapter 1. If I remember correctly, last week I did a special message on Galatians. It was a general introduction, a general overview of the book. Because in Galatians chapter 1, verse number 2, Paul says to the churches of Galatia. So we know who he's writing to. And if you were to go to Acts chapter 13 and 14, he's writing to cities in that region. And those cities are Derbe and Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia. And we made note of that there are some things that Paul says in the book of Galatians that he did when he first arrived in those cities. Again, found in Acts 13 and 14. For example, if you go to Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, he's basically going to say that man is not justified by the works of law, but he is justified by an obedient faith when he went into Antioch of Pisidia. If I remember, that was the first city he went to in Acts chapter 13 and verse 38 and 39. He goes into the synagogue and he's preaching belief. He's preaching about having an obedient faith, and that is what's going to take to be righteous, to be seen justified in the eyes of God. And so we made those different connections, and so now we're going to make some special connections, some really cool ones just concerning Galatians chapter 1. So let's open up our Bibles to Galatians chapter 1. We're going to skip verse number 4. We're going to get back to it. We're going to tie it all together in that verse, through that verse. So let's start in verse number 6. Galatians chapter 1, verse number 6. It says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him. He is surprised. He is awestruck about what he has been hearing, what is being done in this region. Deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. Verse 7, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, he is to be accursed. A lot of information just within these verses. But here's like a 3-point sermon, a 3-point devotional that Paul just laid out for us. In verse number 6, Paul says there is a different gospel being preached around here. You could say in verse 7, Paul says there is a distorted gospel being preached as well. Verse 8 and 9, Paul says the definite gospel actually needs to be preached around here. And we ask that question, right? Well, then what is the gospel? And we would know, and we answer that question with the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, and that's exactly right. But let's just stick with the context of Galatians chapter 1, and let's ask that question again. What is the gospel? How would the book of Galatians define such a question? I think you can go back to verse number 4. Galatians chapter 1, verse 4 says, who gave himself up for our sins so that he might rescue us from this present evil age. Notice what he says there. He gave himself up for us and he rescued us. Couldn't we say that's a good definition of that word gospel? In fact, Paul, in the rest of Galatians, he is going to expound upon that, or we could say also that he's going to mention that same thought again, just in a different areas in the book of Galatians. In other words, go to Galatians chapter 2, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, a verse we all know because we turn it into a song, but go to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. It says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me, and he gave himself up for me. Doesn't that sound like chapter 1, verse 4? It says, he who gave us up for our sins. But Paul says, going back to verse number 6 of Galatians chapter 1, there's a different message about that message. People have come in here and preached a different message other than that message, the message in verse 4. Paul says there are people, verse number 7 of Galatians 1, who have changed that message. They changed it. And Paul says, the definite gospel, verse 4, that is what needs to be preached. So you have these repeated words, repeated phrases in Galatians chapter 1 that give us a hint of those points. You have gospel, you have the preaching, you have this idea of verse number 9, where Paul says that these are some of the things in which you did not first receive. He's going to mention that thought in verse number 12. Notice what he says in Galatians 1, verse 12. He says, for I neither received it, talking about the gospel, from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul says, number 1, I received the gospel by Jesus Christ himself. He says, I did not receive it from man. Paul says, going back to verse number 9, you know what you have received, Galatians, and what you have received is what is said in verse number 4 of Galatians chapter 1. Paul says what is written in chapter 1 verse 4 and chapter 2 verse 20 of Galatians. Paul says that's the gospel which I preach. That's the gospel in which you received. Man did not give me that gospel. And you know what? That is another word that Paul is repeating in chapter 1 as well. This idea of man or men. You read verse number 10 of Galatians 1. Notice what it says. For I am now seeking the favor of men or of God. Or am I seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. He says that in verse 11 and verse 12. He even started out that way in verse number 1, saying, I'm an apostle. No man sent me. Not even a single man sent me. So he's also saying this idea of, okay, if I was really trying to please man, I wouldn't be preaching the definite gospel. I wouldn't be preaching the things that are written in verse number 4 of Galatians chapter 1. Because if I was pleasing man, I would not be persecuted. Because I'm tickling the ears, if you will. But Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 17, he says, I carry the body marks, the brand marks of Jesus, most likely referring to when he preached the gospel in these cities, they would stone him. And so therefore those were the maybe body marks for the sake of Christ. He was persecuted for the cause of Christ. So as if Paul says in verse number 10, well, because I'm not pleasing man, because I have the body marks of Jesus, the things in which I'm preaching to you did not come from man. Man could not have sent me. The only way I got this message was from Jesus himself, not a group of men, not a single person. There is no way. So as if Paul's also saying too, according to verse number 10 of Galatians chapter 1, these false brethren who are coming in here preaching a different gospel, verse 6, a distorted gospel, verse 7, look at their bodies. Check to see if they have any body marks. Are they suffering for the sake of Christ? Because if they don't have any marks, guess what? They are man pleasers. They're not really a bondservant of Christ, because those who are true bondservants of Christ, they preach the truth of the gospel, and their body can prove that, because those people were hated. They were, treated with violence, aggression. So Paul says, look at my markings, look at my body, look at the suffering I went through for the kingdom of Christ. Look at all this stuff. And so from Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 13 to the end of the chapter, Paul was trying to prove himself of where he got his message. He didn't get it from the apostles. He's like, I'm unknown in that territory. He says that in verse number Verse number 22, he says, I'm unknown in that region. So there's no way I went up to the apostles and got it from them, which would be replying to what he said in verse number 1, right? I didn't get this gospel from the agency of men. I didn't get it from the apostles. Jesus revealed himself to me, and I saw Jesus from my own eyes. He's trying to prove and defend his apostleship. There are people destroying his credibility, and Paul's not going to take a back seat and let this happen. Application wise for us is we got to preach the definite gospel. The gospel is written in verse number 4. We cannot preach a different one. We cannot change it. We cannot distort it. We have to remember, be mindful of the fact that this gospel message did not come from man. Man did not write this. If he did, there would be a whole bunch of mistakes. It came from Jesus Christ, our master, the Messiah. That's where it came from. We need to be mindful of that. Because the more that we're mindful of that, the more that we're going to understand how definite the gospel is, how true that it is, that he gave himself up for us, and that he rescued us from this evil and present age. The more that we're mindful of even that, the more that we're going to understand we're not here to please men. We're here to please Christ. But there's a consequence to that, right? Because what we have received, what we are going to preach, since we're not going to please man and we're going to preach the truth of the gospel, we're going to have some body marks, if you will, the body marks, the brand marks of Jesus. We will be persecuted, spiritually speaking, maybe sometimes even physically. But we have to understand where the message ultimately comes from. We have to understand who the message is really about. It's not about you, it's not about me. Because we're not sent by man, we're sent by Jesus. I pray this is encouraging to you. I pray this is uplifting to you. I pray that you see the beautiful connections just within Galatians chapter 1. We didn't really rave about a word or a phrase, though we mentioned a couple words and phrases in Galatians chapter 1. It's a special message, a message that is being delivered to our young people at the Meadows Church of Christ. Please consider liking and sharing this video, as well as liking and sharing our page. Trying to bring out a lot of content to let people know we're here. Where we are physically is 9195 Dishman Road, 9195 Dishman Road, the Meadows Church of Christ, located in Beaumont in the great state of Texas. Come worship with us Sunday mornings at 9:30 a.m. Bible class for all ages at 11 a.m. We meet back on Sunday evenings at 5 p.m. And we meet in the middle of the week at 6:30 p.m. We would love to see you so that we can love on you, care for you, and hug on you. Again, I've been your host, Remy, or better known as Remington Affrey, the youth minister at the Meadows Church of Christ right here in Beaumont in the great state of Texas. This has been episode 44, a Thursday edition of Remy's Rave of the Day. Hopefully the audio was okay. Hopefully it was better. Lord willing, we'll do this tomorrow, Friday edition of Remy's Rave of the Day, episode number 45, around 3 p.m. Lord willing, we'll do that again. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Have a great rest of your week. Lord willing, we'll see you next time. Godspeed.